Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're really exploring how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I actually have with me here Julian Agyeman, who's a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He's on the East Coast, coming to us through the video here. He's also, though, the author of a really interesting book that is of relevance to our discussion here, Sharing Cities, a case study for truly smart and sustainable cities. And one thing I will say about you, Julian, you are like a you're hitting a bunch of our themes here. We're all interested in the future of cities and how to make cities better. We're interested in issues around sustainability this year. We're looking a lot deeper on how does the sharing resources and others make a big impact on sustainability. We're also trying to get more global, and you have a background in other countries. And we're also really interested in the justice aspect, the social justice piece that you bring to the table. So really looking forward to this conversation with you today. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Peter.
Now you have a slight accent there, and my wife, who's British, always says, let's establish up front a little bit of your background. So tell us where you're from a little bit, and a little bit of your background. And I know you did a lot of work over in Great Britain, basically.
Yeah, I was born in East Yorkshire, up in the sort of northeast of England, and I went to university in Durham and Newcastle before doing a sort of master's and PhD down in London. But yeah, I'm pleased to say that despite 18, 19 years in the United States, I've not lost my accent.
That's always a point of pride for the Brits, that's for sure. But now you're at Tufts.
Yeah.
Now, you're the originator of this concept of just sustainability, and I know you've been working with that for a long time. So why don't you give us a little sense of where that is and kind of the roots of that and how your career has kind of been working in that theme for a while now?
Sure, yeah. If I were to go out onto the street of any city, probably anywhere in the world, and ask what is sustainability, 9 out of 10, or maybe 10 out of 10 people would say, well, it's about the environment. And of course, it is about the environment, but it's about so much more. I could envisage us having very strong green legislation and legislating for environmental protection and cleanliness. But if our society wasn't more socially just with a greater commitment to equity, would it really be sustainable? So what I noticed, especially in the 90s, after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, that places, cities, municipalities were rushing towards this idea of sustainability, but actually it was what I'd call greening. It wasn't really asking the more difficult questions about social justice and equity. And most of the academic and practice materials that I read had what I called an equity deficit. Equity was the dirty little secret that nobody really wanted to talk about, but secretly people knew that at some stage they were going to have to engage with it. And it was really in the late 90s, early 2000s that a group of us started to think about how the environmental justice movement in the US especially was really doing great things, but at a policy level and at a planning level, which is really where I work these days, policymakers and planners were paying lip service to environmental justice in many ways because they saw it as an activist agenda. And so what we thought was, can we get the justice of environmental justice into this new agenda of sustainability? And hence the idea of just sustainabilities came about. And it's quite a simple concept, you know, how do we improve people's quality of life now and into the future? How do we do that in a just and equitable manner? And how do we do that while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems? So I don't want anybody to get me wrong. Just sustainabilities is a very strong prescription for living within environmental limits, but we have to look at issues of social justice and equity as well. And I'm more convinced now, 16, 17 years on since developing the concept, that this is the case. And what I'm very pleased to see as well is that there are more and more references now to this concept of just sustainabilities. Now, if just sustainabilities then all of my other explorations have been facets of that, and the most recent one has been the idea of sharing cities. But I've looked at urban design through a just sustainabilities lens. I've looked at food justice through a just sustainabilities lens. I've looked at the development of sustainable communities. So everything in my work is an exploration of this concept of just sustainabilities.
Well, before we kind of map it up, and we will soon, into the current kind of iterations of the sharing economy and things that are the kind of current kind of way of thinking about sharing cities. Talk about this equity gap a little bit more. Are you basically saying that even if you want a sustainable, and in the environmental sense, sustainable kind of situation of the cities or countries of the world, you absolutely have to address the kind of inequalities or the kind of out of whack imbalances essentially of inequalities to actually carry out essentially environmental sustainability? Or are you saying that just like environmental sustainability is something to be dealt with, we have an unsustainable society unless we deal with issues of inequity, and that they're kind of parallel kind of issues? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to clarify the two.
Well, let me give you an example. I mean, most of my work actually has been at the more city scale, municipal scale, but let's go global. In the early 2000s, there was some papers started coming out of the Journal of Environmental Economics. And one that I remember very well was looking at, is there a link between social justice and the likelihood of environmental protection? And the countries in the world, no surprise, with the greatest commitment to social justice, measured by access to medical care, access to good education, number of women in parliaments, a whole raft of factors, gave the Scandinavian countries the top ranking in terms of social justice. When the authors then looked at likelihood and strength of environmental regulations, they found that, lo and behold, the Nordic countries were the same. They were the countries that had the greatest commitment to environmental protection. Now, they weren't trying to say that this is a causal effect either way, but what they were saying is something's going on here. Maybe the way we treat each other can be indicative of the way we treat the environment. Now, although they didn't go on to look at countries at the other end of the scale, I think we can think about countries that are trashing their people, and they're generally trashing the environment. So I think we can't say there's a causal link, but there is something in the way that we treat each other that reflects on the way we treat the environment, and perhaps the other way around as well. But it wasn't really until the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, when this inequalities agenda started to hit the media and academic discourse. And there was one particular book called The Spirit Level. The Spirit Level, in English, it just means a level for measuring whether a surface is flat. Anyway, The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, two British researchers, showed, I think, conclusively several things. Number one, it is not poverty in the world that is the most corrosive, it is inequality. And the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the data showed, and they gathered 40 years of quantitative data from across the world, comparable data from across the world, the countries with the greatest gap between rich and poor had many more problems as regards alcoholism, domestic violence, teen pregnancies, incarceration rates. On any social factor, the greater the inequality, there was a correlation with increasing social problems. Very interesting as well was the fact that those countries that had the greatest gap between rich and poor had the highest advertising revenues. Now, this is very interesting. Advertisers love inequality. Why? Because we like to keep up with the Joneses. The bigger the gap between rich and poor, the more people spend to try and elevate themselves within society. And they called this competitive consumption, okay? And what's interesting for me from a sustainability point of view was a point they made, and they didn't really develop it, but I think it's really worth developing and has been developed since, is that competitive consumption, which is typical in more unequal societies, drives our carbon footprint. Carbon footprints fuel climate change. So countries with the greatest inequality, they concluded, have some of the highest carbon footprints. And my colleague Juliet Shaw at Boston College, I think many people who know about the sharing economy will know Juliet's work. Juliet's just done some work that shows on a state basis in the United States, the states with the greatest inequality also have the biggest carbon footprint. So inequality has an effect on the environment. What more evidence do we need that there is a need for more just sustainabilities? So, you know, and I know Bill McKibben, and I think he's a great climate change campaigner, but, you know, Bill, get on the bus. We need to campaign against inequality, as well as just campaigning for more sustainable transportation or more sustainable agriculture. Inequality between and within nations is a driver of climate change. And as we know, climate change is one of our biggest problems today. So that's, for me, that is really, I think, evidence that there are linkages between inequality and environmental and sustainability effects.
Well, yeah, I mean, in fact, it seems like you are making a causal link, and a pretty compelling case, actually, that to actually get true sustainability, we're going to need to deal with this inequality issue, which is interesting. I mean, I guess as an academic, you're probably maybe hedging that a little bit or something.
Yeah, when I was saying there isn't a causal link, that was the paper that I was referring to, Scandinavia. No, I think there's a causal link here. I think we can easily make a causal link. And what's really interesting, I mean, if you think back to the days, and you and I, Peter, are old enough to remember 1988, when Chico Mendes was killed in the Amazon rainforest. Now, immediately, Friends of the Earth in the UK, because I was in the UK at the time, Friends of the Earth said, oh, this ecologist, this environmental campaigner has been killed. Chico Mendes was a trade union organizer and president of the Brazilian Rubber Tappers Union. But he was also an environmentalist. And my point here is that in other parts of the world, the links between human rights, social justice, and environmental protection are obvious, and they are obvious through the organizations that are developed. Similarly, when, and I forget the name of the guy now who was killed in the Niger Delta, Ken Saro-Wiwa. When Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed, campaigning against the flaring of oil wells, his partners, his friends, formed the Ogoni Human Rights and Environment Organization. But yet here in the global north, we seem to separate out human rights and social justice on the one hand, and that's kind of Amnesty International, and then Greenpeace campaigns on the environmental issues. We're not successful at either because we haven't joined up. And we need to, as the Europeans say, we need more joined up thinking. And I think we would be far more effective on a range of campaigns if we looked across these issues. And just to bring it right home to Boston, in the late 90s, there was a crisis in one of Boston's lowest income neighborhoods, Roxbury. The crisis was asthma, and it's still a big problem. Roxbury has 5 times the asthma rate of the rest of Massachusetts. At that time, there were 11 diesel bus garages in the Roxbury area. Local kids, through their school and through an organization called ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment, decided to investigate why asthma was such a problem in this neighborhood. One of the things they did was to look at Massachusetts anti-idling laws, very strict anti-idling laws, 5 minutes. They found that in some of the bus garages, buses were idling for an hour and a half, 2 hours on hot summer afternoons. They decided to set up a campaign called Clean Buses for Boston. Brilliant campaign. They got environmental justice organizations, they got green groups like the Sierra Club and New England's Conservation Law Foundation, groups that normally wouldn't talk to each other, but they came together over this Clean Buses for Boston campaign because it was a win-win. It was a win for the social justice groups because pollution loadings in Roxbury were highest, and therefore benefits for cleaner buses would be better. But for green groups, it was a win because, again, clean air is good for everyone. So in many ways, what I see as a just sustainability can be brought together by building coalitions on things that we can win on. We too often talking about differences and we can't work together. Well, Clean Buses for Boston was one of these just sustainabilities coalitions that really worked. And in the early 2000s, there were 350 compressed natural gas buses on the roads of Boston because of the work of these kids. So again, this is just, at different scales, there is a compelling case for a just sustainability praxis, if you like.
I love it, and you make a very compelling case there. Now, so let's move your body of work into the more recent phase here, around these sharing cities, and one of the issues we're working on is the sharing economy and how to make it work for everyone. Yep. So very much on a kind of social equity side of things too. So the title of your book is Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. And it's kind of playing off, I think, this smart cities idea, but why don't you explain to us a little bit what you were playing with there and bring it up into your thinking into the sharing economy context?
Sure. Yeah, where to start? It's a huge book. It's a massive read, and my colleague Duncan McLaren and I, we delved into areas, evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, that neither of us were 100% on. But the basic case is this: we think that a reinvention of sharing, and I say reinvention of sharing because implicit in the book is that sharing is a deep human trait. We wouldn't have got off the plains of Africa if not for sharing. We couldn't have felled these large animals by ourselves, and so we had to band together. Trust and reputation developed. Ideas of sharing and reciprocity developed as a result of this. Some of the first cities, the first cities, were shared spaces. And what we feel is that the sharing economy as such has, despite good intentions in many ways, and what better intention could there be for sharing a room in your house or for sharing a ride with somebody? But the sharing economy has been derailed in many ways by a flood of venture capital. So the book is not a critique of the notion of sharing, but it's saying maybe we should think more broadly about sharing. Maybe we should not just bound sharing as a transactional economic activity, but see sharing as a relational process in which we, as dwellers in cities, and increasingly we are in the world, share infrastructure, public space. We share the public realm. Ultimately, we share an urban commons. And the book really is about how do we reinvent the urban commons? How do we see sharing not simply as a transactional issue? We're not criticizing it necessarily. Some of the services that we have in urban areas might best be delivered through market processes. But what we're saying is cities, regulators should think about how we can open up the urban commons. Now, complicating this slightly, and something that, watching your other contributors to this series, I think failed to really nail, is that we are increasingly in what we call cities of difference, intercultural cities, cities where we confront otherness. Many people see this as a problem. Many people see diversity as something to be managed, something to be explored. I see it as an advantage, as I'll go on to describe. But one of the great challenges, I think, certainly in US cities, as we are beginning to self-sort in many ways, is how do we create shared spaces of engagement, places where we can experience difference, and places where we can make contact across difference, because there is a sort of long-standing 50, 60-year-old theory in psychology called contact theory. And it goes like this. It's so alarmingly simple. The more contact you have with people who are different, the more tolerant and the more accepting you're likely to be. Now, let me give you an example. In Britain, when the vote for leaving the European Union was on, and remember, this vote wasn't about economics, this was about immigration. So this brought out the Little Englander mentality, but not in the cities, not in London or Manchester, but in places like Boston, Lincolnshire, tiny little Boston, Lincolnshire, where there's virtually no immigrants. The point is, contact works. London is progressive because it's diverse and it sees the case for diversity. And anybody who's eaten food in London recently has realized that London food is so much better now. London is really, really diverse.
I will vouch for that.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, my point is, sharing in the way we see it in the book is a far more spatial principle, spatial as in spatialized, and it's a far more deep and relational principle than that simply put forward by the sharing economy. And the city of the future, the successful city of the future, will see itself as a shared space and will develop policies, plans, zoning, approaches, and visions that take into account the need to create these spaces of engagement where we are in the presence of otherness. And just one final point on this. I mean, I work in urban planning now, and a beguilingly simple definition of urban planning is that of Emeritus Professor Patsy Healy from Newcastle University in England. And she says, planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. What a fabulous way to look at urban planning. Two great words, coexistence and shared space. And I think if we take that as the driving principle behind sharing cities, we will go a long way. Coexistence, shared space. And that shared space is becoming increasingly diverse and different. And very few people I talk to in the sharing economy really have got to grips with this idea of difference.
Well, now, a couple things here. This is totally spot on the kind of things we're working with here. So in some respects, cities have always been the collecting points of people from differences, and
Yep.
From the ancient Greek city-states and all that kind of stuff, right? And so there's a level of, yes, that's happening. Is there something differentiated kind of happening now? And as you point out, in England, or whether it's here in the United States, urban centers tend to be more tolerant and embracing of diversity, and the politics around that tend to reflect that. So talk a little bit more about the new things that might be going on here in the last couple of decades that might differentiate it from what's happening, or essentially call for new kinds of ways of thinking about this shared space, or forcing this kind of mixing, or I don't know what you're kind of referring to in terms of what's needed to kind of accelerate those or expand those sharing spaces.
Well, I think if I understand your question correctly here, I'm underwhelmed in many ways, certainly in the UK and in the US, by the lack of vision of some mayors and senior administrators. Tell me a mayor in the United States or in Britain who has developed a narrative around the intercultural city, who has developed a vision of an intercultural future where different cultures mix and mingle, where we get hybrid identities, where we get fusions. I mean, we love Asian fusion food. We love the fusions of different foods. That's one very simple level. And interestingly, food is one environment, one policy area, and one practical area where we do come together. We love sampling each other's food. I wonder, could restaurants do more to help us not just enjoy people's food, but understand people's cultures? People outside the US might not know about this, but I love Anthony Bourdain's travel and food reflections around the world. He really gets to grips with culture and food. And I wonder, we maybe need to make more of food in a way, as a way of bringing cultures together, and not just in the pastiche way that we do it at the moment. So I want to see more mayors with vision. Now, let me give you my two best examples globally of how vision has worked. Bogota. Bogota, Colombia, in the late 90s was not a nice place to be. And there were two visionary mayors, Antanas Mockus, literally who literally transformed the way the city thought about itself through a whole range of crazy events, having mime artists as traffic police, having a national women's, a citywide women's night out where he encouraged men to stay in. He animated and made the city perform in a very different way. And then came in Enrique Peñalosa. Enrique Peñalosa came into a city that had transformed itself in the way that it thought. And he developed the ciclovia, which is the cycleways. He developed parks and urban spaces because he said in parks, people meet as equals. We have to meet across difference. He developed programs by slashing the roads budget because he decided that so many people in Bogota didn't have access to cars. Why were they spending so much money on roads? So he prioritized public space and civic infrastructure. Switch then to the new darling of urban planning, which is Medellin, Colombia. Medellin, Colombia was in the 1980s, many people will remember, drug-riddled city. It was the headquarters of the Escobar cartel. The city mayors and the city's foundations decided something's got to change here. And they developed a philosophy called social urbanism. Social urbanism works like this. Let's focus our resources on developing the urban commons. Let's give access to those people up in the hillside favelas or the comunas. Let's give them access to the great resources of this city. They used funding from the city's own public utility to develop cable car systems up into the hillsides. They developed libraries, parks, walkways. They basically opened up the urban commons, and now Medellin is winning all of these awards for the sort of turnaround city. In 30 years, the philosophy of social urbanism has really opened up this city as a sparkling example of what can happen. Now, the principle that they operate on, social urbanism, is also part of a principle called urban acupuncture. By targeting resources in pockets in areas of deprivation, they hope to spearhead economic development, growth, and so it's quite a remarkable change story. And what they also do very well in Medellin is participatory budgeting. They have the largest participatory budget in the world, which is where people are invited to decide on options for how the city spends its money. Not only that, when the options have been decided, people are consulted through a participatory planning process as to how that particular option should be implemented. So again, this, although it's not called sharing in Medellin, it is all about sharing. And I think this is a really important point to make. We must be aware that not everybody is going to talk about the sharing economy, but some people are doing sharing and sharing cities without even talking about it. So I think it's another great example of a sharing city that is not calling itself a sharing city, but has a driving philosophy of social urbanism that is literally rewriting the way the city sees itself and reinventing the urban commons of that city.
Okay, so you're pointing out some interesting global examples, which are always good for us, of how essentially led by the public, mayors or infrastructure of kind of public funding and things to kind of rework cities. Let's go with this piece of the sharing economy private sector actors here a little bit. I just want to get a little deeper into what you're saying there a little bit. Now, so one of the things I think that we've been hearing from other people talking about this issue is how the fact of having someone, a stranger from out of your city, come into your home and you greeting them or interacting with them, or potentially even if it's a room, sharing experiences with them and pointing out where to go, and people get to kind of know each other and stuff, that is part of this melding issue. And the same thing, like if you're in a car, instead of just sitting in your car by yourself driving in, if you're all kind of five of you and you're all coming from different parts of the city, that there is this kind of mashup or this melding of characters that come through these services. And so I guess what you're saying is you're not that's a good thing from your point of view, but talk a little bit more about the good and the bad pieces of essentially the emerging sharing economy as we know it, at least in that private sector version.
Yeah, again, Duncan and I in the book are not saying the sharing economy is bad. And what's really interesting for me, I think, is that, the original idea of, sharing a room in your house, renting out a room, or, as I said, sharing the car is a great idea. But what happens when people get exploited? What happens when neighborhoods become gentrified or unaffordable because rents go up because people want to rent their rooms out on a daily basis rather than to, a worker who can't afford, the high rents. So there are problems, I think, but they're not insurmountable. And several of your other commentators have been talking about a stronger role for municipalities. And what I'd like to see is municipalities regulating in a proactive way, rather than being caught on the hoof as they seem to be with the likes of Airbnb and Uber. So, I think of Amsterdam, for instance, which recognized, hey, this is a great idea, this renting out rooms. But you know what? We don't want parts of our city turning into little dormitories for Airbnb. We don't want the city to become unaffordable to lower income people. We don't want the character of some of our great neighborhoods to change. So let's regulate. And I think we've got to do that. And again, as I say, several of your commentators have said it. I think we can do it, but it needs a paradigm shift in the way the cities see themselves and the way that they see both the sharing economy as both a potential source of revenue, but also as a way, as you've just indicated, and as especially my millennial students see the sharing economy as a way to just jump in someone's car and become friends. They have a very different view to some of my older students who are a little bit more wary of just jumping in a car with somebody. But the millennials are, it's second nature, absolute second nature to them. So yes, I want to see cities regulate much more, and they have a bunch of tools. April Rin and Janelle Olsey's book, Policies for Shareable Cities, is a fabulous resource for any city that wants to look at what is possible. And I think what Janelle and April Rin do extremely well is show what can be done within current regulatory frameworks before even moving into, new smart regulations that we might need in the future. So I think being proactive rather than reactive, forming working relationships with sharing economy organizations, I think these are some of the key ways forward.
So when you talk about the paradigm shift, so just to clarify that, so you're saying instead of being reactive to what's already happening and kind of trying to deal with the collateral damage at some level or the repercussions, you're saying what you got to see is a paradigm shift in cities getting ahead of the game, really understanding where this is going and could go, and actually creating an environment that essentially makes the most of the positive aspects of this and mitigates the negative. So is that one way of kind of
Yeah,
saying,
yeah,
rephrasing what you're saying?
absolutely is. Yeah, I mean, look, let me give you an example. This is an interesting example. I was called up a year ago by a very large city-based bike share scheme, and as you know, most of these bike share schemes are private companies, and the bike share scheme, and I won't name them, but they called me up and said, "Hey, Julian, we've been running 2 or 3 years now, and we are very successful. But you know what? We've noticed we've got very few low-income and minority people on our bikes." And I thought to myself, well, on what are you basing your success? Uh, if you don't have a huge demographic within your city using your bikes. Anyway, we carried on, and I said, well, let me think about this. Were people from low income or minority groups involved in the envisioning your bike share scheme? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe you and people like you who dreamt up this scheme have just, put in place a scheme in this city of, vastly different wealth boundaries. Have you just sort of put a scheme in place that suits the middle classes? And they agreed that they had. And so I said, well, look, my challenge to you is, what would a bike share scheme look like if it were based around the needs of people on low incomes and minorities? Because most bike share schemes, don't get me wrong, are based around the needs of like tourists and commuters, many of whom are not low income or minority. And the greater point that we make in the book is that for cities to be successful in intervening in some of these sharing economy projects, what cities have got to do is try and show that unless sharing economy schemes are built with social justice and equity in mind, they will never be more socially just and equitable. Social justice never simply happens. We have to build social justice in. And in one article, I wrote about the difficulty of retrofitting social justice and equity. It's very difficult once you have a bike share scheme that is up and running to then retrofit social justice and equity as an afterthought. But if we go right back to the beginning of my conversation with you about just sustainabilities, that's precisely what a lot of people do. They get something going, make the economic case, and then think, oh my God, it's not applicable to everyone, it's not inclusive, let's retrofit social justice and equity. It doesn't work. And so I want to see more cities helping out, perhaps through things like platform cooperatives, through sort of using creatively some of their funds to create platforms for minorities and low-income groups to develop sharing enterprises themselves. Now, one case in Boston is a municipal composting service run by and envisioned by Latino and African Americans in the Roxbury district of Boston. And they made use of a new Massachusetts law which requires composting of restaurant and food wastes. And they've got a great business, and it's a worker-owned cooperative. And so I think, if cities send the right signals, and if cities can give that little leg up, we could see a lot more entrepreneurialism coming from low-income and minority groups. And it's not. I don't think it's a big jump for cities to do that. They do have funds that they could use in these ways.
Flip it around a little bit to the responsibility maybe to these companies, which you kind of were obliquely getting to there, which is you're essentially challenging the companies as well to integrate more voices into the planning processes, into their prototyping, into their understanding of it. Are there other kind of things you might think about that they could be doing as well as because there's a kind of a public sphere, mayors who are running the cities. How do we lead from that side. And then there's kind of these, these technology companies, platform companies essentially, that are also could do things a little bit differently. And one of the things it sounds like are there other ways to think about what they could do differently to kind of both accommodate more sustainable practices, but also the social justice piece of it, the side of the sustainability?
Well, there's been a whole lot of discussion, and I'm sure you've had people talking about this. If you look at the personnel within sharing economy startups, if you look at the decision making within some of the venture capital companies that are funding some of the startups, it's not diverse, period. And when I mentioned earlier on about engagement and public space and the need for contact, this is another space, another public space where we need contact. And I would like to see, some pipelines developed to bring young, low-income, minority entrepreneurs into this sharing economy space. Mm-hmm. I could think of, a huge range of projects that they might involve themselves in, improving their neighborhoods and making money, either in a for-profit way or as a platform cooperative. I can think of many ways that young minority entrepreneurs in Boston could do very well. Let me give you one example. So in the Boston metro area, obviously, is Cambridge. I'm sitting about a mile away from probably the world's biggest biotech cluster and biotech startup cluster. And then 2 miles away from me and 2 miles away from that cluster is this neighborhood called Roxbury in Boston. There's billions of dollars going into Kendall Square, and there isn't billions of dollars going into Roxbury. What about a social innovation fund? These companies wouldn't notice if a small percentage of their profit could be taken as forming a social innovation fund, which could then go to fund minority entrepreneurs, startups in the Roxbury area. And this brings me to this point about the smart city. I go to conferences where there are two poles. At one end are the smart city tech people, the engineers who just want to wire up the city. Then at the other end, there's people like me who think that cities are only smart in that they release the capacities of all of their residents. That's the smart city to me. Now, it's about bringing technology and the money that is in the technology industry. It's about bringing that to bear in a way that can float all boats. And my worry is that many people are missing out on what could be, fabulous ways to encourage entrepreneurship in a more diverse range of people. Because at the moment, there just isn't the funding available. And in our cash-strapped cities, and given the present administration for the foreseeable future, I think cities are going to be increasingly cash-strapped, especially those that are sanctuary cities. How do we get some of that money into some, sharing economy startups that could be developed in low-income neighborhoods?
Got you. One piece of this that's interesting, I just wanted to bring a little discussion here is, I know in some of our research we've been watching how, let's say with home sharing particularly, that there are neighborhoods, if you think about the neighborhoods that serve kind of more marginalized or underprivileged kind of communities, there's basically no hotels. Or very few hotels. And that actually, weirdly, home sharing actually brings this opportunity to bring, and I've seen the maps and various things, we can kind of see this, that actually does brings outsiders into these neighborhoods, and actually in a way that, and then their money into the local businesses, and they're in their local restaurants and coffee shops in a different way. I mean, have you thought about that, or seen any evidence of that, any more studies of that? Is there anything beyond the kind of anecdotal things that I've been kind of seeing around that phenom as a kind of an interesting trend that could actually start to break down those kind of the walls between different neighborhoods and cities, and actually kind of start to, again, mix the cities up differently?
I'm just reminded of a student in my Developing Sustainable Communities class last year, who, when I did my sharing economy, sharing cities talk, he made a very good point. He said, Julian, he said, there are people in my community who don't have any spaces in their house. Their house is full of relatives and etc. Our cars are running 24/7 because when one family is not using the car, another family is. So in many ways, a lot of very low income people their assets are sweated anyway. And so there's no space to sweat them anymore to make a little bit extra in the sharing economy. Now I admit that is, the extreme end. I haven't seen any studies about, sort of like Airbnb in low-income neighborhoods as such, or, encroachment of Airbnb into those neighborhoods. So I don't really know about that. It would be interesting to find out what is happening in that sense. But I tend to go with what my students said, that many people who are low income maximize their space by sharing, if you like, with family and friends, rather than trying to make extra money by renting out. And one thing actually that the book really, I think, does well is to talk about two basic cleavages in sharing. One is what we'd call sociocultural sharing, or historic or evolutionary sharing, and the other is mediated or intermediated sharing. Now, most of the sharing economy that is talked about today is intermediated through technology, through a platform, through an app. What I've just described is sociocultural sharing. It's, my sister has got somebody who needs a room. Can they come and stay at your house for a couple of months? Or, my sister's got a new job. She can't afford to get a car yet. Can we borrow your car during the day when you're not using it? That's sociocultural sharing. And that's the type of sharing that I described at the beginning of this program that has gone on for millennia. I'm not saying one is better than the other. Both can and will coexist. But I think for a lot of people who are on lower incomes, the sociocultural form of sharing is probably going to persist unless there's some big change, unless funding comes in to, help groups of people, develop sharing platforms that are for and designed by people on lower incomes. And I think this is a tremendous research opportunity here. This is a tremendous area for us to look at.
Say more. What are the research opportunities you'd say that would be?
Well, I'd
if you had
say,
to call an
would,
agenda, what is the agenda for research that you could
well, the
say?
agenda here would be to look at, opportunities for developing sharing economy startups within low-income and minority immigrant refugee communities. I was at a conference I was speaking at a conference in Toronto a few months ago, and a guy came up to me, and I've just got to find, I think I've got his card somewhere. I've got to find this. Yes. He gave me his card, and he's from Newcomer Kitchen, Cooking Up Opportunity. And this is basically for Syrian refugees. It's a sharing kitchen for Syrian refugees in Toronto. And I just thought, what a brilliant idea. Newcomerkitchen.ca. Just because people are on the margins of our society doesn't mean to say that they haven't got great ideas and ways of thinking about how A, they can make some money, B, they can improve the quality of their lives, and C, they can become active within neighborhoods. So while Newcomer Kitchen was not actually started by refugees, the CEO and founder came up to me and he said, you know, I love what you're saying about just sustainabilities and about interculturalism, because that's exactly what we're doing with our commissary kitchen here in Toronto. So my point is, somebody fund me to do some research where we look at creative opportunities for both engaging low-income, minority, refugee, immigrant entrepreneurs, but also just let's do an inventory. Let's see what's going on. Let's see what other things are going on. I've heard of projects in New York and in Boston where immigrant cooks, refugee cooks do dinner parties. People get to know about cooking from different parts of the world. So again, we come back to food here. Food, I think, can be the medium through which we can really start to investigate and promote some really interesting forms of sharing. And the great thing about food is that it slows you down. It slows you down. It makes you sit and think and talk. And yeah, I can see it as a great potential area for, certainly for sharing enterprises. And also, you know, when we look at a lot of food preparation is done by women. Women are often very much more marginalized, especially in refugee communities. So again, I think this could be a really good way of involving a range of people.
Well, now as we're coming towards the end of this our conversation, which has been awesome. But let's just end it a little bit with some reflections on going forward. I mean, both these issues that you've been grappling with, we've been looking at the roots of it and the history. We looked at contemporary situation of kind of what's happening out there now and how it could be improved, at least in the near term here. But let's look out a little bit further and say, you know, we've got climate change bearing down, a lot of environmental pressures. If you look in the next 10, 20, 30 years, potentially a lot of pressures on around the world in different cities, migrations, and all kinds of things that might change the dynamic in that space. At the same time, we're getting to a point in this country and the rest of the world too, about these inequality issues are starting to really get to almost the breaking point, and there's a lot of energy and anger and all kinds of things around these things. I mean, do you envision in the next 10, 20 years of a kind of a lot more activity in this sharing space in response to these two kind of meta challenges that we're facing right now as a society? I mean, do you think that, particularly with climate change, heck, there's going to be a lot more reworking cities pretty fundamentally and a lot more resources going to kind of reorganize our footprints here and do things differently? I'm just curious on your own reflections on the future here.
Well, yeah, you know, it's a real difficult question. I mean, yeah, when I think of the three great challenges, I think there's three great challenges. I mean, you know, one is climate change, one is growing inequality, the gap between rich and poor, and the third is racism. These are huge challenges, and the growing xenophobia. Hopefully, it will be France will make the right decision. But you know what we are seeing is an increase in xenophobia and intolerance. So all that I've talked about the notion of sharing is intrinsically about contact, increasing contact between people, managing our coexistence in shared space, about creating spaces for civic engagement and for meeting across difference. These are challenges for cities, civil society. I don't see nations as being the main domain for this kind of work. I see most of the creativity at the city level, certainly in terms of climate change, certainly in terms of interculturalism. I see it as being the cities that are doing most of the creative work. Racism, that's a different scale problem. But I think that any city, region that truly takes on board notions of sharing and truly takes on board these ideas of the sharing city as being, a relational place, a place where people can meet across difference with respect. I think that's a great way forward. One final thing I would mention. There's a very interesting piece of work by a sociologist at Yale called Elijah Anderson. And he talks about the cosmopolitan canopy. And his main work has been on Philadelphia's Reading Terminal Market. And he talks about how you can look across cities and you can find places, often food spaces like the Reading Terminal Market, where there is a civility, where people do talk across difference. And this contrasts in his book with places where people barely look at each other. They are deliberately trying not to look at each other. And I wonder, as an urban planner and the professor in urban planning, can we create these cosmopolitan canopies? Should the role of urban planning be to create these cosmopolitan canopies? They could be libraries, they could be, but they're often public facilities. They're often public facilities. They are shared spaces. And so if we do want people to come together across difference, how do we create more of these cosmopolitan canopies? And that's a challenge. I know it's it's a far cry from dealing with climate change. And on climate change, I have to say, one of my worries is that with rapidly closing windows, it looks more and more like we're going to be looking for technical solutions, geoengineering solutions. I'm not saying I agree with them, but in fact, my co-author of Sharing Cities, Duncan McLaren, is doing his PhD on the justice aspects of geoengineering. Where are we going to dump this carbon? Is it going to be like the old industries and we just dump it in low-income and minority neighborhoods? Or what are the justice aspects of this geoengineered future? Again, I'm not so sure that climate change, the rapid response that we need, can be effectively met through sharing or sharing enterprises. It's part of the solution, but more and more, the way I look at it is we're going to be looking at some radical scientific alterations of the way that we act and behave, rather than just simply trying to change human behavior. Part of the process, but I don't think as humans we're going to change quickly enough to stabilize the climate where it needs to be.
But I mean, it's an honest reflection. It's something that honestly I've been grappling with as well. With a lot of technology people are starting to wrap their heads around the geoengineering piece as well, unfortunately. But I would say, at least from my perspective, to move fast in terms of reorganizing for climate change, it's kind of like a common sense no-brainer that you take the assets that already exist and reorganize them differently to make the most out of those assets, rather than rebuilding total cities and building new assets to kind of deal with, different densities and stuff in cities and all kinds of things that might have to happen with long-term with climate change. So would you say at the very least here, maybe not the long-term thing, but that you expect do you think in your own situation that these two fields that you've touched on, the kind of reorganizing cities around sharing more, whether it's private sector driven through these tech platforms or through visionary mayors and kind of public spaces, do you think that's going to become an increasing space of activity in the next 10 to 20 years, given these outside pressures, or do you expect it'll kind of pretty much be on the trajectory we're on today?
Yeah, I think cities are increasingly going to really look at maximizing their assets. I mean, Seoul has begun to map the assets that could be shared. Some cities are starting to look at, you know, could tendering and could you favor companies from the sharing economy? Could you favor local platform cooperatives? Cities are beginning to look at co-production. The simplest level, city wants to plant street trees. It doesn't have the facility to go out and water the street trees during the summer. Hot summers, street trees die. So you ask the people outside the tree pits if they will just throw a bucket of water a week over the tree. That's very simple co-production of a tree. There are many other ways that co-production could work, where the city blurs the division between producer of services and user of services. There are many different ways, and cities could also look at becoming a hub for sharing services. Cities could start to use some of the funding that they have for sharing economy startups. Especially, I would like to see focusing on those who don't have traditional access to capital. So I think there's many ways that the city of the future can embrace this idea of sharing, can embrace this idea of just sustainabilities, and can harness the capacities. I mean, what is the greatest resource of a city? It's its people. I've yet to find the city that truly harnesses the great capacities of its people. That's what the smart city of the future will be, not just a city that is wired for technology. So I think if we can harness some of the smart technologies and some of the private financing that's going into some of these smart cities, if we can harness that to also help people realize their capabilities, and especially those who are, through no fault of their own, deprived of the ability to thrive. That's a form of justice. It's it's what Amartya Sen would, freedom as a form of justice, the freedom to achieve your capabilities. And so I think we need to see cities rewriting the narrative. And if the Victorian period, certainly in Britain, was defined, the Victorian municipality was defined by kind of social paternalism, I think the city of the 21st century should be defined by a vision of sharing futures. That's my feeling.
So that seems like a perfect place to stop. And it's been a terrific conversation. We've had awesome insights into the future of cities, sustainability, global aspects of that, and a piece on really reflecting hard on the social justice aspect of the sustainability with Julian here today. Thank you.
Thank you.